Okay, welcome everybody. This is kind of an unusual, not an unusual class, but I know that you had some wonderful coaching experience from Bernie yesterday, and of course DC is doing it right now. Now this is an interesting top spin. In this case, you're going to learn to give coaching insights through various communication skills rather than listen to others coach you. So this is really important for those people who do a lot of story coaching. It's really great for teachers because you're always trying to be a coach, and I'm very sensitive to that because most teachers are not. They're a critic, Listen, this has nothing to do with you, but your speech sucked. Well, you can't separate a person from an exercise like that, right? And therein lies the rub, because when it comes to coaching and critiquing, they're extraordinarily different. I'm going to tell you a story. Warren, I think you've heard it before. I apologize, but you'll hear it again. I'm going to tell you a story. And what I would like all of you to do is, while I tell the story, make mental notes, because I'm going to ask each of you, what did you like about the story? Just one thing. Hopefully you'll like more than one, but just one thing. And then I'm going to ask you to share one thing that I can do to make the story stronger. Fair enough? So what's one thing you like? What's one thing that I can do to make it stronger? That kind of a focal point is a great place to start. Because you're a smart group, if you are forced to look at something positive, you've got to look at something positive. You've got to find it, and it has to be unmanufactured. This in itself extends your listening ability. Listening isn't hearing. Hearing is our ability to have sound waves enter our ears and come out the other side. But listening is our ability to sense and interpret and respond to information. Really fine-tune our listening skills. So that's why even if you hate a story, looking for something positive is really important to do if you're interested in coaching. That's obvious. So let me tell you the story. I love dogs. I'll bet many of you do, if not all. And I've had dogs much of my life, and they've all been very, very special. I don't want to speak too loudly because one of them is taking a nap downstairs, and I don't want to offend him or insult him. But last time, about 14 years ago, I wanted to adopt a beagle. I just love beagles. They're just sort of a consummate American dog. So I went to a breeder and I walked around, and he said to me, "Now these are all hunters." And I'm thinking, well, I don't do that, so maybe I'm looking for the wrong breed. He said, "Oh, no. Some of these puppies, they don't care whether they hunt or not, but in case you do, these are hunters." So I walked up to this one little puppy, female puppy. I looked at it, and I swear to God, it was talking to me. She was talking to me. I looked at her, and I said, "I'm not a hunter." And she looked back at me, and she said, "Do I look like a huntress to you?" So I knew that was the right dog. Named her Sadie. Took her home, and already she began to become a very integral part of the family. As soon as we walked in at the time in my apartment, she looked to the right, saw a Tempur-Pedic bed, and I could tell she said, "That will be mine." Now, I just want to determine where all of the snacks come from, where are the treats held, so I can sort of park there as well. Just a wonderfully funny dog, just wonderful. The whole notion about oxytocin, that love hormone in our pets, it really is true. They really are, our souls incarnate. Well, when Sadie got a little bit older, we went for a ride like we always did. She was great at running errands with me, and I was, if you know Houston at all, I was driving down Montrose Boulevard, and at the corner of Montrose and Richmond, a fairly busy intersection in the middle of the city, I noticed around me at a red light that motorists were looking at a car that was in front of me to the right. And I don't know what they were looking at, but I looked, and I noticed it was a man who was somewhat disfigured. He was clearly in a bad fire. I could just tell that. But then I noticed that he turned, looked at my car, and started to smile. Not at me, but because Sadie had her head out in the back window, smiling at him, just wagging her tongue and tail and smiling. Now, she didn't see any kind of disfiguration, right? All she saw was a gentleman who was happy to see her. And I guess if I had to define the love of a dog, that would probably be it. She was wonderful. A few years later, she was riddled with arthritis, and it was very sad, as you might imagine. She was just a wonderful, wonderful dog. And she did the best she could. You know, she had surgery, and we did everything that we could at that time to help her get through this, but it wasn't to be. When she was just shy of her 16th birthday, she had to be put down. And my heart was ripped apart. And those of you who've had this happen with your dogs and cats, you know precisely what I'm talking about. So I took Sadie to our vet, wonderful, wonderful vet. She was really great. And I was there with her when she gave her the injection. And I looked her in the eyes. And you know, this is one of those stories that Warren talked about yesterday that you can't tell until you process it. Because I looked at her eyes and I lost it. I just looked at a soul. Her eyes were so soulful, human-like. And she looked at me, and if I had to interpret it, she said, "Thank you for my life. Thank you for taking care of me." I stayed with her for a few moments. I got into the car, came home. It was funny, when I got in the car and I was backing out of the parking lot, I couldn't even look behind me because that's where she always sat. So I just backed out without looking in the back. I drove home, about 10 minutes. When I drove into my apartment, and I never do this except I did that day, it was a Saturday morning. When I drove into the apartment, I looked to my left, and that's where all of the mailboxes are. I have no reason to look there. I've never looked there. I know where they are. I drove in, and I looked at the mailboxes. This is at about 10 a.m. And I saw a young man, probably 35-ish, with sunglasses, smiling at me, just smiling. And he was walking 2 beagle puppies. Now, I am a person who believes in messages, and frankly, as I get older, I believe in them even more. At that time, yeah, you know, I believed in messages, but I still had this, isn't that a coincidence? And my wife assured me, no, it's not a coincidence. And my friend said, no, it's not a coincidence. It's a message. Sadie is telling you that she's all right. So he looks at me smiling, the 2 little puppies, being as happy as you might imagine 2 beagle puppies being, and I smiled. Now, my dog just was put down, my daughter, and I was smiling. The next day, I went in to talk to my manager. Actually, not the next day, later that day, I talked to my manager, Stephanie, and I said, who's the guy that lives here with the 2 beagle puppies? And she said, Hank, there is nobody who lives here with 2 beagle puppies. You're the only one who had a beagle at all. Well, this is a very dog-friendly context. This is a really dog-friendly apartment building, though, so they must be around. She said, I don't know. I don't know of any man that you're describing with 2 beagle puppies. That would be pretty obvious. So the next day, I went over to the mailboxes where I saw many of the tenants, and I said, do any of you know of a young man in his 30s who has 2 beagle puppies? He said, no, not at all. None. I even went to apartment just for the fun of it and said, hey, listen, I live here too. You ever see a guy with 2 beagle puppies? Nobody ever saw a guy with 2 beagle puppies. Now, I wasn't seeing it. It was not an illusion. It was right there. And I think to myself sometimes, these wonderful furry family friends of ours do linger on, and they do continue to take care of us. I know that she's okay because of that episode. And I know that she's looking after me now. And the wonderful thing about having dogs is that they're all going to do that. And that makes me feel very secure, very safe, and very loved. Okay, that's my story. Thank you. So, again, the question is, what's one thing that you like? And I hope you like a lot, but one thing that you liked, and one thing that I can do to make that story stronger. Tweed, have you got one, or?
Well, first of all, I thought you did an excellent job of capturing the essence of Sadie, and the story just draws you in naturally because I think I can't speak for everyone, but we've kind of been down that road, been there. I've been there with when we had to put a dog down and looked into its face. That whole thing is so very real to me. Uh, and just let me kind of sideswipe here a little bit. This is my very first meeting with this group, and I've never been a coach. I'm just trying to figure out how to give a really good speech. So I'm not a coach, but I just thought, it was a strong story, and it's relatable. I mean, it's a very human story because it's one of those been there, done that things. Uh, and I don't know if there's some other kind of hook at the end, but there doesn't have to be. It just speaks for itself. It's kind of monolithic, and it's a standalone. So I know that's no coaching for me, but
Well, first of
really
all,
like the
don't
story.
underestimate yourself as a coach. Are you a parent, grandparent?
Oh yeah, been there, done that.
Okay, well then you're a coach.
Yeah,
It's very it's difficult to be a parent without being a guiding force, and we're all adults here. We know that some parents are better than others. So we know that some talk to their kids differently. We know that some are more supportive than others. And we know that their communicative repertoire matches that. I mean, there's a real correlation between how we communicate and whether our children feel supportive, right? And so don't underestimate yourself as a coach. I think we coach a lot more than you might think. But is there anything that I could do with that story, Tweed, that would make it stronger, in your opinion?
I would ask, what's your goal of the story before I figured out how to make it stronger?
Okay, the goal?
Yeah.
Okay, so
What's the
you
point?
want, right, so you want the lesson to be clearer.
No. In order to figure out a way to make it stronger, I need to know what you wanted people to walk away
Ah,
feeling or
okay.
thinking.
Very good. Yeah, and you're right. You're right. Um, because whatever I wanted you to walk away with wasn't really punctuated, and that's a really good point. That's a very good
yeah.
point. Right.
But that I'd have the same thing. I'd say the same thing.
Okay.
Uh, he's right
Great.
on.
Hi, Fran. Uh, did you hear the story? Because I know you.
Just the second half. I'm sorry I got in
Oh,
late.
no, that's all right. That's okay. Warren, what did you like about the story? One thing. You're muted. Here we go.
How's this? Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, any dog story is going to be a good story because I, like most people, love dogs. And the unconditional love of the dog came through and just brought back many good memories of my own. And what I saw in you was a sort of a reciprocal love that came from that. And so dogs and love just gave me warm feelings.
Great. Thank you. What can I do to make it stronger?
Okay, I was so busy enjoying the story that I wasn't really thinking critically. So I may have missed something, but one small idea. I think you started by a general statement about your attachment to dogs. You mentioned the dog downstairs that was
Right,
sleeping.
right.
And then you talked about the dog you adopted, the Beagle, and that when you met the Beagle, y'all had this instant connection. And then what I remember next was the story on Montrose Boulevard at Richmond about the Beagle getting a smile from the gentleman in the car next to you.
Hmm.
And then what I remember next was the dog, you having to put the dog down. And if I've missed something, forgive me, but I think I would have liked another short paragraph, maybe before the scene on Richmond or after, of something endearing between you and the dog. Just one other thing that happened, maybe when the
Yeah.
dog came home with you, and some ritual you had, or some.
Well, yeah, yeah. We when I came home, the first thing that Sadie did was look to her right, saw my bed, and said, "That Tempur-Pedic mattress is going to be mine." Yeah,
Yeah.
that's one thing that I said.
Oh,
Yeah.
did you? And so if I missed that, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. That's all right. No, 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 no. Because that could have been cultivated a little bit, actually, because there are a couple more rituals that I might have thrown in to establish a better feel for the relationship that she and I had. So I think that's a very good comment. Very, very good. Yeah.
So that when she dies, the audience knows how much she meant to you in multiple ways.
Yeah. Dean, well, you already said that you already talked about what you would like, what I wanted out of it. Okay. Tim, what do you think? What did you like about it, and what is one thing that you would like to see me change?
Let me start out by talking about your coaching. First of all, I like the fact that you started out with this session on coaching by saying you wanted feedback, because I think it's important for someone who's telling a story that wants feedback to let know, and if you're a coach, to make sure that before you offer feedback that you have the person ask for it. And secondly, I love the fact that you said, give me something positive about the story, because that I'm real big on, let's start out with the positive before we get to the idea of improvement. So I like what Warren said a lot. I love dogs too. My dog is sitting on my lap right this second. So I agree with him. I think that probably the story could have been longer, and usually we're all talking about how to shorten things, but I think I would have liked a few more examples. I loved your story arc to begin with, and Dean asked the purpose of the story. I thought that you hit really, really well. I got a purpose out of the story without your saying anything else other than that. I love the story arc. I love the fact that you introduced Sadie to us in a humorous way, and that the arc ended up. But if you had started the story in the vets when you were taking her to have her put down, that would have been horrible. The fact that you introduced her, that we laughed with you, that we enjoyed Sadie before it came to the end, made it more meaningful when you talked about the idea of the love continuing even after death. I liked that very, very much. I liked the fact that one thing that I actually laughed at was when you saw Sadie for the first time and you had her talking back to you, because those of us that love dogs really understand that. So those are the things I liked. This is really niggling, but in the beginning, when you were introducing the story, and Warren talked about this too, you started out by saying, I love dogs, and I bet most of you love dogs too. And you threw that away completely in order to get into the story. It was framing, I know, but you really did rush through that. And I think that if you had slowed down, it would have been a little more effective introduction in saying, I love dogs, and I bet most of you do too, slowing that down. And the other thing that I would say as a consideration um, is a technical thing. And for the most part, your Zoom performance was enormously effective. But Warren talked about, and it was the point where you were talking about, I don't know if most of you know Houston, but I was on Montrose. And when you said I was on Montrose, you shifted in your chair and you came really far forward into the picture, and it was distracting to see you in real close up at that moment, which was a throwaway line, really, but it it was jarring. Most of the time, you were very effective on Zoom, but just in shifting in your chair, you came way too close to the camera at that point. And those were the two things that I would say. Don't throw away your beginning about loving dogs,
Right.
and be
And
aware
there
of your
is,
position.
right. And that's really good listening. I know Fran, and I don't know if John, did you come in a little late? Where is he? I don't see him. Okay, Fran, I know you came in a little bit late. I was talking about the fact that one thing that coaching can really help us do is become a better listener. So what I was suggesting is that everybody listen for something they like, because there's always something to like if you listen carefully enough. And what is one thing that I could do to make the story stronger? Because there's never a perfect story.
I missed the early part about how you found the dog and the anecdotes about what a lovely dog she was. When I came in, someone was having medical issues, and I wasn't quite sure that it was a dog until you said you were going to have them put down, which is not usually true of family members. So I got it at that point. But as a dog owner too, I could assume the early parts about how wonderful the dog was because they are, and it's a very relatable story because so many people do know dogs, or even those who don't have one have read about them and how human-like their affections are, or even better than human in many ways. I thought that part of the story went very well, and the pain of taking the dog to the vet is clear. I wasn't so sure what was going to happen with the puppies and the man who turned out not to have existed in anyone else's experience. And so I didn't know quite what to think of that when no one else had seen the dog. And I presume this really happened? Or is it something that you added for storytelling effect?
Well, it really happened. See, that's the thing. But you're absolutely right when you say what happened to him. I don't know what happened to him either. We couldn't find him. They didn't live there, but they were very real. I suppose that. Well, I was going to say maybe they were a delusion, but no, I was totally awake driving, for goodness sake. So they were real. But
Well,
what?
it leaves a little bit of doubt about what to think of the point of the story. It's nice to think of that vision, perhaps, that you had as being a message from Sadie.
Yeah.
But it leaves it with my coaching. I've learned from my brother Ken that three things to look for are: what do you want listeners to know, to learn as a result of hearing the story?
Yeah.
How do you want them to feel? And is there anything you would like them to do as a result of the story?
Very, very
so
good.
Focusing on why are you telling the story?
Yeah, and that's something that Keith was talking about a little bit earlier about the purpose, and of course Warren heard it a little bit differently, and he manages, in his mind, through his eyes, the purpose was apparent. But you see, it doesn't really make any difference, because what you're doing is actually proving the point. And that is, we all have different perceptions about stories. That's not a profound point, I understand. What is kind of profound is how we communicate these to people who want our advice, right? So, for example, sometimes we use the term feedback synonymously with coaching and critiquing. And, as far as I'm concerned, if you want to call coaching constructive feedback, that's fine. But technically, from a definitional standpoint, feedback is the reactive response that you give to someone. So if I said to you, for example, hey, I liked your ending, I'm not giving you any guidance. I'm not telling you improve it or don't approve it. I'm saying I liked your guidance. Now, there's nothing wrong with that statement, but from that perspective, it's feedback. If I wanted to be a coach, I might say something like, I really enjoyed your ending. I think that if you just lingered a little bit longer, perhaps taking a pause and giving us a chance to reflect, it would even be more effective. Critique might be, it's a really bad ending and you delivered it in the most boring way. And I think that if you think about being a storyteller, why don't you think about something else? I'm exaggerating here to make a point. But the point is that we use the word criticism, critiquing, a lot. And that's okay, but it's not synonymous with coaching. It really is not synonymous. And again, the beauty, at least as far as I'm concerned, about coaching is that it really does teach you to become a better listener. It's sort of, I liken it to not so much having a sixth sense, but being to magnify the others. I always think about the play Butterflies Are Free by Leonard Gersh, right? I think we all probably remember that because I think we're all members of AARP. And it was a great play. It was in the late 60s. And it was about, if you don't know it, it was about a young man who was born blind. Don Baker was his name. And he lived in Scarsdale, and he was a musician, a guitarist. But he knew that he couldn't make it as a guitarist in Scarsdale, so he moved to New York City, the Washington Square area. And he rented an apartment that was at one time 2 apartments, so it was attached to another one. And it had a door, which wasn't locked. And the person who lived in that other apartment was Jill Tanner, a young lady who was, kind of goofy. It was Goldie Hawn who played her on Broadway. And one day, Don Baker is playing his guitar. He's practicing. He's 18 years old. And Jill Tanner walks in and says, "Hey, you're really good." And of course, he says, "Where did you come from?" "The apartment next door. I could just kind of walk in if I want to." So he took a double take, and she walked in, and the first thing she said was, "This place is so neat. It is so tidy. I didn't think men were tidy. I didn't think men could be organized." And his response was, "Yeah, I know where everything is." And she walked around, and then she lit up a cigarette and took the ashtray off of the coffee table. Walked around, right, and flicked ashes in the coffee table. And then Don Baker lights up a cigarette and is flicking ashes on the coffee table, where the ashtray should have been. And she looks at this and she asks, "Is there something that you know that I don't know, like ashes are good for the table? Is that why you keep flicking them there?" And he very seriously, very calmly asks, "Did you move the ashtray?" And she said, "Of course. What are you, blind?" And he said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I am." And, she gets very embarrassed. She says, "Oh my God, I'm sorry that I said that. What a fool I am." And he said, "Don't worry about it. I was born blind. Most people can't tell that I'm blind. I'm very well adjusted." And then she asked him a few moments later, "Is it true that blind people have a sixth sense?" To which he replies, "Well, if that were true, we'd still only have 5. Now, wouldn't we?" Right? And I love that line, and you know what that means. It means that we have our senses. There's no a new one manufactured, but a really good listener knows how to use those senses on a maximum level. And I think coaches, in many ways, are able to do that. You know, they not only instinctively know what to say and how to say it, but they instinctively understand something about your persona, even if you really pay very close attention. And I think that's very, very helpful. What I would like to do is, I do have a handout for you in the folder, but it might be helpful if we sort of look at it together, if we may. Can all of you see it? We're all good? Okay, good, great. Okay. Okay, there we go. Just to talk about a few things now that we did that, because when we are done with this, I'm going to ask one of you to tell us a short story. Fran, if you don't mind, I'm going to, just any story, a short story. If you don't feel comfortable, though, I don't, but every one of us, come on. Storyteller. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to tell a short 3-minute story. And what we're going to do is, just as everyone did with me, we're going to identify one thing we really liked about your story and one thing that might make your story stronger. However, as we go through some of these considerations and some of these tools, I'd like us to try to use them so that our coaching skills can become even more clear, okay? So I start by talking a little bit about what critics and coaches do differently. Critic, as you might imagine, points out flaws and mistakes, often resulting in the teller being paralyzed or feeling ashamed or no longer being motivated. One of the things that we know is that coaching and criticizing have a lot to do with our self-concept. That's one of the reasons why we are very much responsible for shaping other people's self-concept. For those of us who teach, and I know several of us do or did, it's really important to know that. The things that you say to a student, you can confirm, you can reject, and you can ignore, what's called disconfirmation. So, if you say something in class, I can rip you apart inadvertently and give you an opportunity to feel so rejected that you may not want to say anything again, or you may not want to ask a question again, right? And that's what happens when we're harsh with our storytellers. I have a lot of students who, I'd like to think of myself as a good coach, at least that's what they tell me, but they have told me that they've taken public speaking courses, and the first thing they say is, I was really afraid of this class because I thought you were going to just lambaste me. I thought you were just going to just annihilate me because, Dr. So-and-so, Professor So-and-so, they did that all the time. They would say things like, look, you're an intelligent guy, but I don't know why you put together this piece of crap that none of us really want to listen to. Can't you tell by looking at us that we were bored? Can't you tell by looking at us that half of us were looking at our watch? Can't you tell that a few of us were looking at the clock, hoping and praying class ended now? Now, to those educators, they were legitimate, right? But that's not coaching. Coaching is, if you took the same scenario, I'm not sure, I'm kind of improvising here, but if you said to that person, I understand why people see that, because they think that feedback is always going to be negative, because we think about criticism. And that's unfortunate, but I assure you that in this class, you're going to hear feedback, coaching, which are words that I prefer to use. You may view it as criticism, but if, for example, you were in a situation where you didn't do an assignment very well, and I know you're intelligent, rather than saying what that particular educator said to you, I'd probably say something like, you have some really good ideas in this speech, and look, I know that you've told me earlier that you've never given one before, so the idea of standing up and even delivering one is much more positive than you might think. But you're a smart guy, and you know that an informative speech requires some research, not opinions. So I think that if you did some research about that topic, and I'll be happy to help you insert it, it would be a lot better. Again, I'm just improvising, but you get the idea. So coaching and critiquing, they really are very, very different. And I'm going to say what I say to everybody. It doesn't matter to me whether you can distinguish between coaching and criticizing and feedback, just as long as we coach, right? It's just as long as what we do is actually coaching. Coaching acts as a compass, in my mind, guiding the teller where he or she needs to go. And all of this, again, really does affect our self-concept. I can't really intensify that enough. It has so much to do with how we feel and how apprehensive we are doing any kind of verbal performance. A little bit more of a contrast, a coach is designed to improve performance and help you win, which is a term I like to use in this case. A critic is designed to unload anger, highlight deficits, or enforce unrealistic standards. At least that's been my experience and what I've read. Tone and communication, a coach is encouraging, patient. They try to be solutions-oriented. They use collaborative techniques, two-way dialogue to involve you in their development. How do you feel about that? What do you think about that? What do you think about that comment I made? A critic is demeaning, is absolute, very judgmental, relies on commands or sweeping statements like, you always fail. You always tend to do this, right? Which can be really, really tough. It's not unlike a teacher saying, Tim, I had your sister Sally, and I just want you to know she was so smart, and so far, you're just not acting like her, Tim, are you? Whatever. You get the idea, okay. How they treat failure. A coach treats failure as temporary, situational, and as an opportunity of learning. And again, I think these points are relatively obvious, but they're important to go over again. A critic treats failure as a permanent character flaw, fostering fear and a mixed mindset. In terms of relationship and safety, a coach is an approachable mentor who roots for your success and makes you feel safe taking risks. Try it, you'll be all right. You're not going to fail. You're just going to try another way, another alternative, another method. And a critic, someone you may want to avoid because they often publicize your vulnerabilities or intimidate you. You ever have one of those teachers who have a stack of exams they're about to hand back? The A's are on top, the F's are on the bottom. Don't you just love these folks? All right, and you're waiting there, you're just sweating to death because she hasn't even, she's gotten to the bottom of the pile and she hasn't even gotten to your exam yet. You failed. Everybody knows it. Is it anybody's business, right? One of the reasons I don't like to post grades. But you get the idea. What I offer here, and this is just for your sake, I've also offered a chart which gives you a little bit more of a contrast between coaching and critiquing that you might want to turn to whenever you're thinking about how you would modify your communication skills in order to sound more coach-like. Some key takeaways that we've talked about so far. Always coach on specific actions or behaviors rather than attacking a person's character, personality, or intelligence. And that sounds, who would ever do that? Well, unfortunately, in education research, many teachers do that. I don't want to say most because we don't know, but many do. So it is a problem. Feedback is most effective when given frequently and promptly in the moment, rather than saved up for a formal review which can feel like a sudden critique. If you've ever worked in organizations, you know that when you have your annual review and you only have one, and you're sitting there anticipating a really good one, and suddenly, your boss says to you, well, I want to begin by saying, I believe we made a mistake hiring you. But let me be a little bit more clear. And don't think that is a fake, but don't think I'm making that up. Unfortunately, I've heard that several times. I really have. Without these intermittent critiques, in order to give people some sense of how they're being guided toward a hopefully productive destination. So a few recommended communication tools, a few things that we can use in our coaching statements. We all know what coaching is, right? We know what coaching does. We know what the purpose of coaching is. But we want to try to omit cliches. So, for example, and these are going to seem harmless, so I apologize because these are going to be a little conflicting at times. But for example, if we say things like, I know that intelligence runs in your family, so would you please give me a little bit more of your skill set? Or everybody goes through the same thing. I know exactly what you're talking about because I felt that way when I was your age. Now, much of this might be true. It really is. But when we offer a cliche, without realizing it, we kind of minimize the problem that the other person is experiencing. So, for example, if we said instead something like, I can understand why you're very apprehensive standing up there. People are watching you. You want to do a good job, and you're worried about what they're thinking. I can understand that, right? Which would be better than saying, I went through the same thing. Okay, now what? Where do you go from there? Using I statements. This one is extremely practical, not just in storytelling, but in something like life, right? Instead of saying, you piss me off, you aggravate me, you can do better than that, you did that on purpose. Did you just do that on purpose? That was so bad, I can't believe that someone like you would do that, right? What do I statements do? Well, I statements simply take ownership, and they force you to be clear. And that's why I think this one is very coaching friendly. So instead of saying, Keith, you really didn't give us a very good opening. Do better next time. Well, Dean's not going to know what to do. What do you mean, do better next time? With what? You didn't like it, but aren't you going to give me any suggestions? Right? But we do that a lot, thinking that the other person knows what we know. What's obvious to one person isn't obvious to another. But if I said to Dean, I think that the way that you delivered that opening is really good, and it was a case study worth listening to, I would like to hear you make that a little bit more urgent. That makes sense to you? A little more urgent. Now, that would just be an example of how I would use an I statement in order to give Keith, the storyteller, a little bit more guidance and hopefully get more of a solution. State one comment at a time. Your opening was terrible. You have no case studies. I don't know what you think an image is, but you don't have any. I think that most people waited for you to just be done. And by the way, you went overtime. So we're going to have to do that. It's like a doctor saying, listen, here's what you got to do. Lose weight, stop smoking, eat a good diet, walk a little bit, and could you be nicer? Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to do all of that. I know we laugh, but it's because it's funny. We can't do all of that. So the same thing is true in coaching. One comment at one time, and watch your tone. There's no reason to be angry or harsh or demeaning. I'm guilty of that sometimes, and I just, I hate myself for doing that. I get frustrated sometimes, but you really have to watch your tone and use words that work. Use words that work. If you're teaching a beginning class in public speaking, And you want to say things like, make sure that your verbal support is commensurate to the thesis, which I didn't think was very clear. Well, your students ought to know what that means, but if it's a beginning class, maybe they don't. Maybe they don't. Finding things that reinforce your topic, things like quotations or a case study, or maybe an example that you can draw from your life would really reinforce it and make your points more clear, And of course, clarity in communication, and I don't mean to be hyperbolic, but clarity is everything. Clarity is everything. That's why we communicate. We want clarity. And we want to be able to provide examples of what we think a person should do if we can. So if I said to Dean, give me try another sense of urgency, I would like to give him an example, right? I would say, smoke detectors save lives. I would say, smoke detectors save lives. So the numbers and case studies I'm about to offer you is not a figment of our imagination. It's about how long we want to live when there's a fire in our home, God forbid. Sense of urgency. I would want to give him an example. Coaches, we can disagree and feedback can still be valid. Like I mentioned earlier, we have different perceptions about the story that I told, but I want to hear those differences because those differences allow me to piecemeal together an entirely different crafting strategy. So I want that, for the same reason why we want second, third opinions, why we want another editor, you get the idea. Mrs. Nesbitt would have given me an A. I heard Betsy's story and no one thought hers was better than mine, and you gave me a lower grade. You made a mistake, Dr. Jekyll. Okay, relax, because this is what students might say to us, but we too kind of give this impression. So now that we have a few things to draw from, I think I'm going to put this here, right here. And I'm going to ask Fran, thank you, Fran, to tell us about a 3-minute story, if you don't mind, please. I know that's short, but tell us a 3-minute story, and the rest of us, I want you to really hone in on one thing you really liked about Fran's story and one thing that you think might be able to make the story stronger. Fran?
If I can interrupt for just a second.
Sure.
Sorry, Fran. So because Frank is still sharing the screen, one of the little tricks for Zoom people, if you'll notice that there is videos on the right side of your screen and the shared on the left, you can actually, there's a little handle right in the middle and you can widen the videos some. Not that we're trying to minimize Hank's sharing screen, but that will make, since there's only 6 of us in the room, the video is a little bit larger to see what everyone's going to be sharing.
All right.
Okay. Some years ago, here in Bartlesville, north of Tulsa, I met an old-timer who told me a story about something that happened when he was a kid in the 1930s. It was 1934, and his class was invited in December 1934. They were invited to the small private airport west of town to watch Wiley Post set a high-altitude record. Wiley Post was a famous aviator, and he had been sponsored by the Phillips Petroleum Company, which was headquartered right here in Bartlesville. He was helping them to promote their aviation fuel. And so they were going to help fuel his flight. He was going to try to go higher than 50,000 feet. Now, he had worked with the B.F. Goodrich Company to make a pressure suit. It was parachute silk and covered with rubber. He had a helmet made from an aluminum diver's helmet so that he could have supplemental oxygen. And the old fellas I was talking with said that they watched him come out and get into the plane, And then everyone waited while the mayor made speeches and other people made speeches, and the kids stood there in the cold. And finally, Wiley taxied down the runway and took off, and they watched his plane circle higher and higher into the December sky until they couldn't see it. But the Bartlesville Astronomy Society had set up their telescopes, and they were tracking it as he went higher and higher. And they stood around and waited. They were waiting for him to come back down after he had set his altitude record. But the time went by, and they were getting colder and colder. And finally, he said, they were ushered into the aircraft hangar, and they were given cups of hot chocolate to warm up with. And everybody was very concerned. Well, what had happened to Wiley Post? He had gone so high. And then the phone rang, and the mayor answered the phone, and he came back, and he said, Wiley Post has just landed in Nowata, which is 50 miles to the east. He had discovered the jet stream. That's the day that Wiley Post demonstrated that the jet stream did exist. Meteorologists had known about how weather patterns often move from west to east. They had suspected something was up there, but Wiley Post took off from Bartlesville, America, and he found it.
That was great, Fran. Thank you. Yeah, I love those stories because I know nothing about science, and very little about science. And anytime you can offer history and give me an explanation about a term that we hear frequently, and in my case, not understand, it's great. This was a great learning experience. Your pacing, your tone, the way that you simplify your examples really worked beautifully. Let's just go around. We don't have a whole lot of time, but just want to see if we can briefly tell Fran one thing we loved about it. There was a lot to like, and one thing that she might do to make it stronger. Warren, we'll start with you.
Well, to what Hank said, I would add that what really was my hook for this whole thing was that you talked to eyewitnesses and you told the story through their eyes.
Yes.
I mean, I've read a lot of history and science that's in the third person, and it gives the data and the facts, but it comes alive when you tell it that way. Mm-hmm. I can see those old timers, and I relate to that because I knew a lot of old people growing up who told me stories that I still remember well. As far as one thing you could change, I would not change a thing. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.
It was perfect.
Fair enough. Tweed?
Yeah, I guess I'm here.
Yes.
I love the story. I know a little bit about Mr. Post anyway, so it made it a little more real to me. But I like the way that you drew out the suspense. They were gone. Where were they? I like that. And I thought you might could have driven that out about a tick more, but again, I wouldn't change a whole lot of anything in there. I mean, it's the whole story, the whole caboodle, and the capsule. I like it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jim?
Fran, I really liked the fact that you oriented us 100% as to time, place. When you mentioned Wiley Post, I had a second where I thought, is she going to tell us who Wiley Post is? Because I know that having taught for a number of years, I know that sometimes my students wouldn't know things I would make reference to, and you immediately came in and said, a very famous aviator. So you covered me right away. I only had a chance to wonder whether you were going to do that. I really enjoyed the fact that you physically took us along for Wiley Post's flight. You pointed up, you looked up. I found myself looking up when you pointed up. So it was very, very effective. I'm coming back and agreeing with Warren again. I don't know where I would tell you to change anything in that. I thought it was an enormously well constructed and well delivered story.
And there is no such thing as a perfect story, and we have many that sound like a perfect story, and we don't want to change those. Absolutely.
Yeah.
What I also liked is I knew the name, and I thought, oh my God, who is he? And then, of course, thank goodness, Fran told me a minute later. And I like that because, you can't take for granted that we all know who the characters are in your story. I mean, that sounds obvious, but wow.
I had seen the estimated age of the other faces in the gallery, and I figured once I reminded you, you would all know. If I was telling this story to much younger people, I would talk about Wiley Post's other exploits
Right.
and the fact
of course,
that he had
of
just
course,
one eye.
And of course, given our demographics, we do need to be reminded
Well,
sometime. Dean, I'm sorry. One thing you liked?
Well, actually, I had never heard of Wiley Post before, so I
Okay.
obviously had a deficient education in my childhood.
he's much younger.
I don't know about that. But anyway, I was also going to comment about what Tim commented about looking up and the circling and everything. I also, and think about storytelling, I think about what are the reality of the people in your story that they're experiencing. So the fact that they were now going in to get hot chocolate and all that kind of made that a little bit more real. And just taking a step back, one of the things that, because I teach a lot of technology, one of the things I often tell my classes are there are no mistakes, just learning opportunities. So with that attitude towards anything, I think that just helps.
Very good. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Fran, for that. It's hard to, think of a story right away, and I really appreciated that.
Well, that was a story that I got out of my files yesterday. I was thinking of using it in my science workshop,
All
and I
right.
didn't, and I haven't really told it much before, so I'm glad I had the opportunity.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something about criticism versus coaching. This town runs on.
I'm sorry to keep interrupting as kind of the tech guy. Normally we would be ending now, but because the next session is on a different Zoom account, you can go as long as you want. So just to let you know.
Okay, I wanted to say
I won't
that
do that to you. I know. Unless you want
when I
to
teach
order dinner.
when I teach storytelling in this town, I don't use the word coach because this town runs on sports. And coaches are sometimes idiots who do nothing but criticize. That's all they know how to do. You fool, why did you shouldn't, you made us. And I don't want to use the word coach because it has such negative connotations to
How ironic.
kids when
Yeah.
I use it.
How
Yeah.
ironic. Yeah.
So we have peer buddies who work together, and I teach them to use I statements rather than you should have.
Yeah.
Use
Yeah.
I had. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just
I don't know many coaches personally, but when I did a radio show years ago, I forgot his name, but he was the coach who at Boston College with Doug Flutie, if you remember the name Doug Flutie, the quarterback, and he said that Doug Flutie was a leader. This is what he said. He said Doug Flutie was a leader because he knew how to coach the team. He taught me how to coach the team, and he knew how to coach the team. So, I asked him, well, what does that mean? Because, good leaders are good leaders. You're a good leader. He said he knew how to talk to people. He knew how to separate the person from the issue. He knew how to say something without being demeaning. He was always positive. He never told anybody that they were wrong or they failed. He always found alternatives. And, that's what a coach is supposed to do. So I really appreciate that example because, a coach uses the label, but they don't know what coaches do. I hope today, gave you an idea of a few things that you can do in order to increase your coaching repertoire. And I'm very sensitive to this because, I'm not always as good as I want to be in terms of coaching and being positive. I find that sometimes I get frustrated, I get very anxious, and I get impatient because I know that people can do better, and that's wrong. So I turn to this as well. Yeah, Dean?
Is mentoring a synonymous term in here? Mentoring?
Well, mentoring, mentoring is, theoretically, it's a synonymous term with coaching. Yes, a mentor, from what I've learned and what I watch, because there's not a total absolute to this, but a mentor is typically observed by another. So in other words, if you are mentoring someone, you get advice, you get the coaching, you get all of that, but if possible, you kind of watch that person work. I am a mentor to docents at the Holocaust Museum, and they are obligated to go on a tour with me. Now, we talk about different techniques, and I talk about them and their coaching styles, but in my opinion, that would be one of the things that you would add to the coaching formula. Warren?
Another metaphor I like is story midwife. When I first came into this storytelling world about 10 years ago, the first person who ever helped me with the story called herself a midwife or story midwife. I thought that was pretty cool.
That's great. I wonder how she came up with that name. That's great. Yeah. All of this has to do with communication. I'm going to just say the obvious. It all has to do with communication. And this, I'm speaking now as a communication scholar who unfortunately knows this, but we're the worst communicators in the world. There's just no other way to phrase it. Our listening ability is so pitiful that we listen. If we were given a 5-minute paragraph of content and we were asked to retain as much as we could, a good listener would remember about 14% of it after a 5-minute period of time. Now, that's only comprehension. Other ways of listening is analysis, synthesis, all that stuff. We're not good listeners. And the main reason we're not a good listener is because we've been taught that listening isn't as important as talking. If I'm sitting in class and Tweed, my little friend, is in front of me, and the teacher asks a question, and he raises his hand, and I know that if you answer this question, you're going to be rewarded. I'm going to push his hand down, and I'm going to try to be called on because I want that star on my forehead. It doesn't make any difference if Tweed is about to say the most brilliant thing God ever created. I don't care. I want to be rewarded. I don't want to learn from my peers. I want to be rewarded, right? And it's no wonder that we interrupt each other, don't we? Because we're sometimes more interested in our own rebuttal as opposed to what the other person has to say. You'll understand this example because of our demographics. When I teach my advanced interviewing class, I show them videos of the Merv Griffin show. If you remember the old Merv Griffin show, he was a great interviewer. And there was one where Martin Luther King was on the show with Harry Belafonte. And there was a live audience, right? And Merv Griffin is asking a few open-ended questions, which actually gave King an opportunity to tell stories. It's another great thing we can do. If we ask open questions, we can actually access stories from the other. And when I turn it off, my student said, that is fake. That's fake. I said, why would you think it's fake? Because no one said anything, nobody interrupted, the audience didn't say anything. He just kept on talking for 10 minutes. I could just stop there and you get the idea, right? It just is, it's an old skill that no one really seems to care about much anymore. We know how important it is. And one of the great things about storytelling is that storytelling does improve our ability to listen. And coaching puts that on steroids. A good coach has got to be a good listener. And if you can do that, and you can kind of pepper in the very specific communicative cues and skills that will craft that positive tone and attitude, well, then we could be coaches and call ourselves coaches much more comfortably. Do you have any questions or comments or anything? I hope this was helpful to you a little bit. Nothing? Okay. Well, again, this handout is for you. It's in the folder file. It's a helpful one, I think. At least that's what people tell me, because it gives you some guidance and it gives you some reminders of how to operationalize the terms coach versus critic, how feedback kind of fits in there as well, and some examples of how you would phrase a criticism in a coaching tone, a coaching encasing, if you will. And all of you coach, we all do, so I think it's really important stuff. Any questions, comments at all? Okay.